museum's officer, so she works with the Shetland Museum and Archives, and she's interested in her research in archaeological textiles. So her talk today will be about walking in the sea. So it's not walking as in walking, it's treating textiles in the sea. Finishing Shetland's annual Viking campaign.
I was really delighted to find out that the main theme of this conference is about the sea, because I have been working on this project for some time, but it's not, cloth making isn't something you associate with the sea, but I'm going to tell you how people use the sea to make cloth and finish cloth. I think I'm going to read so that I stay to time. This paper is part of some ongoing research into cloth production in Shetland during the medieval and early modern periods. The emphasis here is on vadmal, the cloth that was worn by Shetlanders, but more importantly, it was made to pay rentals and taxes. I'm interested in how it was made and how the payments were organized and what effect this had on Shetland's communities. The sources are piecemeal at best, but there are tantalizing fragments which taken together give a glimpse into vadmal making in Shetland. This paper will focus on one of the final processes in making vadmal, that of fulling, and how Shetlanders used the sea to do this. I will discuss what this might tell us about the organization of vadmal making for tax purposes and how Shetland compared to other areas in the North Atlantic where vadmal was made. First, a little introduction about vadmal. It's a generic term for woolen cloth as a commodity, and it was made for centuries in Northern Europe from Russia to Greenland. Law codes, tax, and trade records show that it was made in many qualities, and that these qualities changed over time. Iceland produced at least 5 different types, and Shetland produced 2. Icelandic vadmal was used as a currency and was very important to the Icelandic economy and its trade links with Norway, England, and even Orkney. But there is no evidence for a parallel situation in Shetland. Shetlandic vadmal was used to pay rentals and taxes and may have been traded locally in private arrangements, but it never reached the level of importance to Shetland's economy as Icelandic vadmal did in Iceland. Nevertheless, Shetlanders used vadmal to pay rentals into the late 17th century, which was a burden on wool resources and at a level which went far beyond that required for normal household use. By the early 18th century, however, the portion of Shetland rentals formerly paid in vadmal was now paid in cash, probably earned through knitting, which rose in prominence during the 17th century. Vadmal continued to be made on a small scale for home use until it was supplanted by industrially made cloth during the 18th and 19th centuries. From a letter dated 1640 by a tax collector based in Scalawa, we know that Shetlandic vadmal was fulled before it was paid. This was a normal finishing process. The most common way to full cloth was to stamp it in a tub of water, urine, or fish stock, sometimes with various types of minerals added. In the Mediterranean, strong men were fullers because the work was extremely rigorous. It could take between 1 and 2 days to full a length of cloth with constant stamping. Stamping was used into modern times, although fulling mills gradually replaced it where cloth production was high. Many of you will be familiar with this form of fulling that was found in the Hebrides, where the tweed was stamped with the hands or feet by a group of women who sang songs as they worked. Although it's not apparent from the photographs or films of this process, it was a highly organized event, and it took all day, sometimes into the evening, with teams of women relieving each other during the process. The women assembled were specialists, known for their knowledge of local tweed qualities and their fulling ability. They had a leader to guide them through song and chant, and who periodically monitored and measured the woolen fabric as it changed form. So whether it was stamped by the hands or feet, fulling was a necessary process which involves strength, stamina, and specialist knowledge about the fabric shrinkage and thickening abilities. Jakobsen records 3 Norn words used to describe fulling in Shetland, 2 of which are about stamping. But there was another way of fulling that was practiced both in Shetland and in Faroe. This was to place the cloth in the sea and let the movement of the water fill the cloth. Danish textile historians have called this method the oldest and most primitive way of fulling cloth. But Faroese historians suggest sea fulling was used only for large amounts of cloth, so that in Shetland and Faroe, this method probably does not predate the introduction of taxation in these lands by the Norwegian kingdom. Fulling in the sea was first recorded in Shetland about 1630, when vadmal was still paid for rentals. The place name Tuvakudda and its variations are recorded on old maps, in place name studies, and in surviving folk knowledge. Now, you won't be able to see the names on here, but if you want a copy of that map, I can provide it. I've cut off Fair Isle and Fula, I'm sorry if you're from those areas, because there are no place names there, and I wanted the map to be as big as possible. In the last few years, I've gathered together the evidence for these sites, which were the evidence which was first collected by Brian Smith in the 1990s, and then by Eileen Brooke Freeman as part of the Shetland Place Names Project. In 2012, I asked my colleague, Lena Hammerlund, a textile specialist from Gothenburg, to join me in recording the known sites. As we worked, local people told us about more sites. We now know of 25 places with this name, and we have visited and recorded nearly all of them. We also fulled 3 lengths of cloth at 2 of the sites to understand what skills and knowledge were needed to do this type of fulling. During site visits, we recorded the size, shape, and depth of the Tuvakudda. We noted access, whether it was by land or boat, and movement of water according to the sea conditions. We looked for signs of recent erosion and compared the site today with how it appeared on the first edition Ordnance Survey maps recorded in 1878 to understand any recent changes in coastline. We studied how it would be possible to secure the cloth to the immediate landforms. We noted the surface of the surrounding geology. Was it smooth or would it tear the cloth? And whether we were dealing with bedrock or a changeable surface of pebbles. In short, we considered how well it would work as a fulling site, or whether there was too great a potential for loss or destruction of the cloth. We classified the sites into 2 main types. The deep cleft type has access to the open sea and a constant movement of water, even on calm days or at low tide. We considered this type of site to be the quickest for fulling and the best for coarse fabric, where beating against the stone sides had to be as hard as possible, but without damaging the cloth. And this is another one of this type. The downside to this type is that it was vulnerable to changes in environmental conditions, since it faced the open sea. For example, when weather conditions changed on the coast of Norway, resulting in an increase in swell along the eastern coast of Shetland, this dramatically increased the force of water pushing in and out of the Tuvakudda. We encountered broken security ropes and a need to check the cloth constantly. Seaweed flooded in during several days of rough weather, which bogged down the cloth and stopped the fulling process. Tuvakudda sites, which were shallow clefts or troughs, in inshore areas did not get much movement of water, and hard compression of the cloth was not possible. These sites were sometimes dry at low tide, which temporarily stopped the fulling process. The shallow sites were less likely to need continual monitoring unless sea or weather conditions changed significantly. But the cloth had to remain in the sea for longer, since it moved only gently, or not at all, at low tide. Now, some sites did not fit either profile, and could not, or some of them could not be located from the information we had. We've got more sites to record, and we will try to resolve these problems during our next round of recording. We were successful in fulling 3 lengths of cloth, but the degree of fulling was not as much as we would have liked for 2 of the pieces. Of the 3 lengths, 2 were made with Shetland wool, which is relatively soft, and 1 was made of a Norwegian Spelsau-Vilsau mix, which was a much harder cloth. When conditions were favorable, that is, when the cloth moved or beat continually, the sea fulling for 1 of the Shetland pieces took about 2 to 3 days in the deep cleft type. For a shallow trough-like tivicutta, the Shetland cloth needed longer, say 4 to 5 days. Our hard-spun Norwegian wool cloth needed 4 to 5 days in a deep cleft type with continual movement. But these time frames are approximate, and they could be tempered by many changeable factors: wind speed and direction, swell, tides, surface geology, and of course seaweed. Like fulling by stamping, it was necessary to periodically check the cloth. Sea fulling is a more gentle process than stamping, so it does not have to be done very often when conditions are favorable. In any case, most of the tivicutta sites were not easily accessible at high tide anyway, so we checked the cloth when we could get at it, or about every 12 hours. Like Shetland, the Faroese used sites along the shoreline to full cloth as well. The description of these sites is remarkably like those for Shetland, although this was recorded about 150 years later. The Faroese word form for the place name, though, is different than in Shetland. Here we see a stronger link with vadmal production. The sites are called vad, with a topographic descriptor. In Shetland, there's only one place name with this form, and it's called the Vadmal Hole, and it's at Brecon in North Yell. So far, there's no evidence for fulling in the sea or either of these place name types in Norway or Iceland. Making and exporting vadmal was remarkably similar in Shetland and Faroe. Both island groups paid part of their rentals in vadmal into the 17th century when knitting became a more important product. You can read this, good. The vadmal from both places was shipped to Bergen and used for similar purposes, although you'll see here that Shetland vadmal was used more for clothing than the Faroese cloth. This may reflect the fact that Shetland produced 2 types of vadmal, at least into the early 16th century, which made it in some ways a more usable export. But what was the relationship between Faroe and Shetland in terms of vadmal making? And why does fulling in the sea only seem to occur in these 2 island groups? The sites themselves and the process of sea fulling sound very similar, and yet the place name forms are so very different. We've lost many of the tivicutta sites along the Shetland shoreline, but they must have existed all over the islands. Did each settlement have their own tivicutta, or were these sites shared like horizontal mills? Some of the known sites are very near one another, such as those in Koningsbrug or in Nibben and immediately across Gunnestervoe. But were these sites used interchangeably by the same communities, depending on the sea conditions? In other words, did one community need several sites so that they could be available at any time? Vadmal was required payment by nearly all settlements. Some paid a small amount, not more than 5 ells, or a few meters. Large farms or tracts of land, such as the rich farmstead at Exnabo or the large areas of grazing at Maywick and Deepdale, paid 40 to 50 ells, or say up to 30 meters of cloth for their rentals, and sometimes the same amount for scat. Payments were made once a year, so that a large amount of cloth had to be fulled across Shetland in late spring or early summer. This was also a busy time for lambing, delling, planting, and peat cutting, tasks which were not confined to the shoreline. These issues raised questions about who was responsible for fulling cloth in Shetland to meet the tax payment. Who was left at the shore to do this and check the cloth? Which member of the household or community was in charge of how much cloth to weave for the annual payment, and how much that cloth would shrink during fulling? These decisions require knowledge about making cloth, but they also need a strong sense of place, knowing and assessing the coastline, the immediate and long-range sea conditions, changes in wind direction and speed, the daily and monthly tide changes. This finishing process for cloth was not especially difficult, and certainly not more tiring than stamping, but it meant working within a seascape that was in constant flux, and trying to complete production of a commodity that the household was required to pay, but could not afford to lose to the sea. Thank you.
Great, finished early.
Okay.
We've got about five minutes for questions. Any comments? Yes.
Carol, first of all, I love experience.
He is born and brought up in the Shetland fishing village of Hamneville. He has worked in the seafood industry all his life. For many years he worked for the Shetland Fishermen's Association before setting up his own fish farming business.